I don't know about you guys, but I always find it very interesting on how mainstream media will just completely 100% disregard certain news stories. It's almost like they're controlled, like somebody's telling them exactly what they can cover, what they can't cover, how to cover it, and what their opinion should be. Now, on the contrary, this show is rapidly becoming known as a beacon of truth. And I wear that as a badge of honor, so thank you. In our next episode, we're covering one of the subjects that mainstream just refuses to cover, but it's something everybody wants to know about. So we are diving in to the mysterious life of Jeffrey Epstein. That's right. We're going into his backstory, people that were involved, as much as we possibly can. And we brought in the resident expert to do it. I have never seen this many facts on the subject, all compiled into one piece of content like what we've just made. Ladies and gentlemen, if you get anything from this show, please head over to Apple Podcasts, head over to Spotify, leave us a review, tell us how we're doing, like, comment, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Please like, comment, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We need it. We just hit 2 million followers, or subscribers, excuse me. Thank you. It is an honor to be able to do this and bring these stories to you guys. And one last thing, I know a lot of you know this, there is a link in the description with thousands of raw cut reels. Take them, download them, spread them everywhere you can, monetize them, make money. All we ask is that you tag the show. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome investigative journalist Nick Bryant to the Sean Ryan Show. Love you all. Enjoy the show. Nick Bryant, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Sean. Appreciate it.
It's an honor to have you here.
It's an honor to be on your show.
So I have been fascinated with the Jeffrey Epstein topic ever since it kind of came to light. And I've been looking for somebody that really knows the ins and outs and all the little details of what was going on in there. It took a little bit for us to find somebody, but you are the perfect fit. And I cannot wait to dive in and see what kind of information you've uncovered.
Unfortunately, it's the government that's with Epstein. We have the government aiding and abetting child trafficking, which is ultimately very sordid, but it's something, and it goes against our grain, the values of Americans. It's anathema to our values, but it's something that we have to straighten out as a society to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, the U.S. government seems to be at the center of a lot of issues today.
Yes.
But I want to give you a quick intro here. So Nick Bryant, you're an advocate and published writer focused on topics such as the plight of disadvantaged children in the U.S. You spent 7 years investigating coast-to-coast child trafficking networks, author of The Franklin Scandal, which we'll get into a little bit, an investigator of the Epstein Network, and published Epstein's Little Black Book that we all hear all about. And so before we kind of really get going, I'm just curious, what got you started in the trafficking genre, bringing awareness to that?
What happened, I'd written a lot about children's issues. That's a topic that's near and dear to my heart, is children's issues, mostly lower socioeconomic children and the travails. And I ultimately co-authored a book called America's Children Triumph or Tragedy that looked at a lot of the shortcomings that our country pays great lip service to children as its most precious resource. But as I showed in America's Children Triumph or Tragedy, the resources aren't allocated for children the way that they should be. And so that's an issue that's very, very close to my heart. And I was a writer and journalist in Minnesota for a number of years, and then I ultimately moved to New York City, and I started writing for magazines there, and I was pitching an editor at Rolling Stone, and I said, well, what do you want me to write an article about? And he goes, pitch me dark stories. And I had no idea I said, I kind of threw my arms up in there. I said, Nazis, Satanists, how dark do you want to get?
Yeah.
And I'd written some dark stories before. That's maybe why he thought I'd specialized in darkness. So you can kind of tell editors, their eyes, there's a little sparkle when you hit something and when I said Satanism, and he goes, Satanists, and I could see that little glint in his eye. So I wasn't really well versed in the subject, but I started looking into the occult fraternities and the darker occult fraternities, and then I talked to various Satanists of various stripes, and I found them to be kind of an unsavory group. But my job was to write an article, and I kind of had a simple plan. I was going to cultivate a relationship with some of these people, and then ultimately attend a dark mass, write a book about it, or a black mass, and then write an article about it. And then I came across this U.S. Customs report. When you're a writer, and a lot of writers will talk about this, when you're a writer, although you're looking at a certain subject, you're always surfing the net for stuff that's tangential to it or that's related to it. And I came across this U.S. Customs report about a cult called the Finders. They had a couple of warehouses in Washington, D.C., and 2 finders had been busted in Tallahassee, Florida, with 6 children. And the 6 children were like ragamuffins, and some concerned citizens called the Tallahassee Police Department. And then the Tallahassee Police Department went to that park and saw the kids and saw the 2 finders, and they arrested the finders and put the kids in child protective services. And what happened there was, and then these 2 finders were charged with multiple counts of child abuse. And the U.S. Customs got involved because there was child pornography. And the D.C. police, the finders had warehouses in D.C., and the D.C. police had been interested in the finders for quite some time.
Are the finders the folks involved in the Franklin scandal?
No. It was kind of my segue into the Franklin scandal. So, with the finders, the D.C. police and the U.S. Customs executed a search warrant on the warehouses of the finders, and they found really very incriminating stuff. And the kids were being held in Tallahassee, and actually a doctor had said that 2 of the kids had been sexually abused. So what happened was I've got the U.S. Customs report, and the U.S. Customs report is so mind-boggling that I put the entire U.S. Customs report in the back of the Franklin scandal. So what happens is that investigation is going full throttle. You've got the Tallahassee Police Department involved, you've got U.S. Customs involved, you've got D.C. police involved, and then you had the FBI involved. And then all of a sudden, and it said this on the report, that the investigation of the finders had become a quote-unquote CIA internal matter, and there'll be no more investigation. So I read that document, and I was just stunned. I was thinking, this does not match the world that I live in. And that opened my mind up to looking for other scenarios that might be like that, where there might be trafficking children, and then intelligence was involved. And then that led me to the Franklin scandal. It was on the internet, there was a lot of talk about, a lot of postings about this pedophile network in Omaha, Nebraska. And this former state senator, his name is John DeCamp, he had written a book about it. And I read the book. I didn't think was really well done. I mean, it wasn't like a regular journalist, but actually, Yorkshire Television in the UK had made a documentary about it, and that documentary had been quashed. So, and you could get the documentary on the internet. So, I got the documentary, and I had a bunch of my friends come to my apartment, and I gave showings of it. And I was thinking, am I losing my mind, or is does this look ominous to you? And they all said, this is very ominous. So I went to Omaha. I knew that something had happened in Omaha, Nebraska, but I wasn't sure exactly what had happened. I thought that there had been some kids molested in Omaha, but the internet was talking about kids being flown from coast to coast, intelligence involved, Boys Town students, which Boys Town is probably the most famous orphanage in the world, talked about all these things, and I was skeptical. I mean, I really tried to keep my mind open, but I was skeptical. But when I got there, I started to talk to people.
Well, we'll get into that in just a second.
Sure.
I want to ask, why is, I mean, it's a fairly obvious question, I guess. It should be near and dear to everybody's heart, but what is it specifically that drew you to bring an exposure to child trafficking and sex exploitation and all of that?
Well, because with the Franklin scandal and also with the Epstein scandal, you've got child trafficking that's being covered up. And as I came across the Franklin scandal 21 years ago, and as I've dug deeper and deeper into this, I've been embraced by anti-trafficking organizations, and I've spoken at anti-trafficking conferences, and I've met a lot of people that have been trafficked, and no one has paid for it.
Yeah.
And that's just something, there has to be justice. The government cannot be covering up child trafficking on any level, local, state, federal. No one should be covering up child trafficking.
You had mentioned something earlier, I can't remember your exact words, but you were saying that basically, I think in essence, you were saying that the government doesn't take this seriously, and the allotted funding and the focus on trafficking it's almost not even there. I mean, I went to a fundraiser for one of those organizations recently, and there was a gentleman that spoke. He was the head of Homeland Security's division in this, and he said there are only 8,000 agents, only 8,000 agents out there that are combating sex trafficking and sex exploitation for children. Meanwhile, it's a $150 billion a year business that we know about. There are 366 million videos out there of children being sexually exploited.
That we know about.
And there's only 8,000. And I'm not talking about 8,000 in the United States. 8,000 in the entire world are working on this stuff. 8,000 in the entire world. That shows you right there that this is not a priority for any government, any agency. I mean, it's ridiculous, which makes me think they're all in on it.
Well, there's a lot of child trafficking that has been covered up. I mean, we know of child trafficking that's been covered up in the United States. We know of child trafficking, I'm talking huge networks that have been covered up in the UK, that have been covered up in Belgium, that have been covered up in Spain, that have been covered up in Argentina. That have been covered up in Mexico. There's a lot of child trafficking networks that have been covered up. And we see this, Epstein is right in our face. Mm-hmm. I mean, we know that Epstein was trafficking all kinds of girls to numerous perpetrators. And only one person has been indicted for those crimes, and that's Ghislaine Maxwell, when we know that there's scores of people that were involved in those crimes. So our government has to have the will to go after traffickers and child pornography. And our government just doesn't show the will now. But it's going to be up to the American people, ultimately. The American people have to put their foot down and say, no more.
Did you know that 1 in 5 Americans have learn a new language on their bucket list? It's true. If that's you, check it off your bucket list this year, because with Babbel, you can start speaking a new language, foreign language, in about 3 weeks. Why Babbel? Because it works. Instead of paying hundreds of dollars for a private tutor or fooling yourself with language apps that are a little more than games, Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are designed by over 150 language experts to help you start speaking a new language, just like I said, in as little as 3 weeks. Here's a special limited time deal for our listeners. To get you started right now, get 55% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/SRS. With over 10 million subscriptions sold, Babbel is real language learning for real conversations. Get 55% off babbel.com/SRS. That's spelled BABBEL.com/SRS. Rules and restrictions apply. Visit babbel.com for terms and details. I don't talk much about money or the economy, but let's face it, ignoring it doesn't help either. Because I believe the government screws up all the time. I think they let down veterans, ship jobs overseas, they help their rich friends make even more money. It is insane. Do you really think they care about helping us out with our money? I don't think so. That's one of the reasons why a lot of folks are stepping away from the government-run systems and starting to diversify their money into real assets like gold and silver. If you're concerned about your finances and the future of your finances like I am, there's a damn good play you can make. Check out Goldco. Goldco will hook you up with a free 2023 Gold IRA kit. This kit will teach you how to help safeguard your savings with real gold and silver. At the very least, it makes sense to get educated about your options. So get your free kit at goldco.com/Ryan or call 855-936-GOLD. Plus, for qualified orders, they'll send you up to $10,000 in free silver as a bonus while supplies last. Quit waiting around for politicians to rescue your finances. Help take control and handle your business yourself. So go ahead and check out goldco.com/Ryan or call 855-936-GOLD to get your free kit today. Just remember, performance may vary, and always consult with a financial professional before making any investment decisions.
This is an instance where the American people really have to get vociferous and correct their government and not allow their government to cover up Epstein. Because there's been other networks that have been covered up. And this is something that the government should not be involved in, is covering up child trafficking, which is essentially aiding and abetting child trafficking. So we're at a point now where we have to put our foot down and say, that's it, no more. We need those Epstein perpetrators indicted. We need those Epstein procurers indicted. And we're not going to settle for anything less. That's what we need.
Let's talk a little bit about the Franklin scandal before we get into Epstein, because that was your first big book. Franklin scandal book. It's about an alleged child prostitution ring out of Omaha, Nebraska that took place in around 1988, managed by Lawrence King, if I'm correct.
There were two primary pimps, Lawrence King of Omaha, Nebraska, and Craig Spence of Washington, D.C.
The victims' ages range from 8 years old to 14 years old, and let's just start there.
Well, with the Franklin scandal, I went to Omaha. I knew that something had gone down with the Franklin scandal, but there was all kinds of internet speculation, and I didn't know how much of that was apocrypha and how much of it wasn't. So when I went to Omaha the first time, and I went there a number of times, but when I went to Omaha the first time, I knew that something had gone on, but I thought it was a local pedophile ring, not like a nationwide network. I didn't think it was involved in blackmail. I thought that local law enforcement had probably covered it up, but not federal law enforcement. So when I got to Omaha the first time, I realized that it was much bigger and uglier than I ever could have imagined. And I took some heat. I had like a death threat, and I was followed.
From who?
A woman. It was funny. I was staying with a friend of mine. I told my friend, I'm going to look into this thing, and I'd known him for many years since I was a teenager. And I said, I'm going to look into this thing. We hadn't hung out in a while, so I'm going to look into this thing and see what's happening, and then then we'll hang out and go do some stuff. And so I told him, I went. The first night I was there, we were having dinner. I told him what I was looking into, and he looked at me like, are you sure? And I said, well, yeah, I'm gonna check this out. So I was staying at his place when a woman came to the door and said, he was there. So, and she said, you're in a great deal of danger, and they're going to kill you. And she was a freaky looking woman. And now my buddy had started, I'd been there for about a week, and my buddy had started to come around with some of the stuff that I was reporting back to him. But then that woman coming to his door and dispensing that, it made both of us, we didn't sleep very easily that night. But here's the thing. By that time, I'd come to the conclusion this was a huge network. It had been in operation for at least a decade. And multiple children were destroyed. And I don't have a family. I'm not married. I don't have children. I can take risks that other people wouldn't be comfortable with taking risks. And I just said, this is too evil. And it was covered up by both federal and state law enforcement and authorities. And I just said, what was done here was just too evil. I'm not going to quit. If I get killed, I get killed. But I'm not going to quit doing this. I'm going to expose this to the best of my ability. And that started my odyssey.
Did this go on? Did the harassment from whoever it was continue?
There was harassment. I think a lot of harassment was thrown at me the first time I was there. And they thought, well, he's probably a journalist from New York, and, we'll never see him again. But there was harassment subsequently, but nothing like it was initially. That was the only time I had like an overt death threat, was the first time I was there. But I was so committed to doing it at that point that whatever difficulties I was going to have, I was willing to endure them to get this story out. Because, as I said, this network that I wrote about in the Franklin Scale, it had been in operation for about 10 years, and it had destroyed scores of children. And it had been covered up by federal and state law enforcement. And I just said, this cannot stand. Something has to be done about this. And I'm going to write a book about it, and hopefully I can get it published. And I was represented by a relatively big literary agent at that point, and I gave them the book proposal. And then within 2 weeks, I was no longer a client of theirs. And then I knew James Fitzgerald. He was an agent. He's since passed away. And he ran a good agency. He had published a number of popular books, or facilitated the publishing of a number of popular books, and he couldn't sell it. I'd met with some publishers, and they were just concerned about libel. And finally, there was a small publisher outside of Eugene, Oregon, that was willing to. And by that time, there were, and I don't know if your listeners and viewers are familiar with the machinations of a grand jury, but with a grand juries are notorious for covering stuff up, because a special prosecutor is picked to prosecute a grand jury. And grand jurors are just citizens that have shown up for jury duty that have been funneled to a grand jury. So, and the special prosecutor calls the witnesses, and also picks the evidence that's shown to the grand jurors. And it's not adversarial, it's just one-sided. And then everything is sealed, and it's against the law to talk about it. So there was a New York judge that said, Supreme Court judge that said, special prosecutors have so much power over grand jurors that they could get them to indict a ham sandwich. And so with this case, the Franklin case, I managed to get the sealed grand jury and testimony of one of the grand juries, and I bring the reader right into that grand jury, and I show how corrupt it is. And because that grand jury declared that all these kids getting abused was a carefully crafted hoax, but it didn't even name who the hoaxers were. It kind of pinned like the hoax on a bunch of drug-addled kids, which was, I mean, and then a federal grand jury said the same thing. That was equally corrupt. And there again, you just need one guy, one special prosecutor who's corrupt, and then he can get the grand jurors to do whatever they want them to do. So these two grand juries had said that there was no child abuse. But after I got the sealed testimony and exhibits of one of those grand juries, I mean, at that point, I was really able to write the book. Because the exhibits gave me a lot of information. And then I was able to show just exactly how one of the grand juries had been co-opted.
Wow. Let's talk about a little bit about what was going on there. So there was alleged abuse. It was widespread series of crimes, including devil worship, cannibalism, drug trafficking, and CIA's arms deals.
Okay, so that comes from the Wikipedia page.
Okay.
And the Wikipedia page is farcical. If you go on my website, I go to I've got a link to the Wikipedia talk page, because you've got like the Wikipedia page and then you've got like the talk section. And that Wikipedia page has been taken over by people that want to make this nonsensical.
Okay.
And there's pages and pages and pages of debate. And actually, I called Jimmy Wales, who started Wikipedia. I'm a pretty good investigator. I was able to get his private cell phone number. And I called him up and I said, you're my last hope for making this Wikipedia page read realistically. And he was completely unwilling to help me. I'm going to release that conversation on my website in the relatively near future.
What did he say? Why wouldn't he?
He said that, well, I'm going to look into it. Send me some emails. And so I sent him some emails, and then he said that he didn't get them. I texted him.
I don't understand why there are so many people in powerful positions that protect pedophiles. Why would you not want to protect the children? Why does everybody in a powerful, I guess I shouldn't say everybody, but it seems to me the more I dive into this subject, the more I see the more elite status you have, the more compliant you are with pedophiles and sex trafficking and sex exploitation. What is it?
Well, I think people reach a certain plateau, socioeconomic plateau, and they're afraid of losing what they have, and they're afraid of not getting what they want. I mean, I think it's that simple. And when I saw, like, some of the
So you're just saying that it's greed, money.
It's fear.
If you're not into pedophilia,
it's fear.
The fear that you place more important. You have more value on money than you do on little kids.
Absolutely, and your status, and your house payments, and your car payments, and your kids' college. There were some people that covered this up that were definitely compromised pedophiles, and that's one thing about our political system is that Americans, and that's why there's so much blowback on that Wikipedia page, is the people that are in control of the Wikipedia page on the Franklin scandal. They want to make sure that it doesn't come out that the government has covered up that pedophile network. And they want to make sure that blackmail, because blackmail plays an integral role. And I've been at this for 21 years, and Epstein had cameras in all of his homes. I mean, Epstein was definitely a blackmail artist. And the government wants to make sure that does not come out, that a huge part of our political system is predicated on blackmail. And especially if that dark, malignant corner of the intelligence that is using blackmail against our politicians and other people, if they were using children, I mean, that would make the American people erupt. So that's why that Wikipedia page is locked down. And that's why this is important. This is, for that dark corner of intelligence, this is Omaha Beach. They're not going to give an inch, because this is the last thing that they want out. And it's amazing how the Epstein scandal has been covered up. If you look at all the victims and all the perpetrators and all the procurers involved in the Epstein network, I mean, we're talking and the people that facilitated it, like the pilots and like Epstein's house managers and the cooks and everybody else. We're talking scores and scores of people, and no one's been indicted except for Ghislaine Maxwell. And that really shows that our government, unfortunately, wants to stop it there. Our government does not, although Americans do, I think, are coming around to the belief that Epstein was taking part in blackmail, or a lot of them, it doesn't make sense. Why is our government aiding and abetting child trafficking? Unless they're protecting some very powerful people and a political process, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the only way that it makes sense.
Yeah.
And I saw that with the Franklin scandal, too. And actually, I think the Franklin network might have been bigger than Epstein's network.
How many kids were involved in the Franklin scandal?
It's difficult to know, but it was operational for about 10 years, and it was getting kids from like Boys Town. And
what's Boys Town?
It's a Catholic orphanage. It's probably the most famous orphanage in the world. And it was getting kids that fell between the cracks. I mean, people like Epstein and then like the
the Catholic Church has a long history of being involved in this stuff.
Yeah.
So that's, unfortunately, I hate to say it, I was raised Catholic, but it doesn't come to me as a surprise. Although it probably wouldn't come to me as a surprise if it was any other. You just I've seen so many, this minister, this guy, this priest, this, it's all, they've all partaken, unfortunately.
The number 2 guy at Boys Town, Father James Kelly, he molested a bunch of kids in upstate New York. And then the Catholic Church, in its infinite wisdom, moved him to Boys Town, where he molested a bunch of other kids. And then eventually they moved him to a prison in Las Vegas. So, because I have come across a lot of kids that were molested by Father Kelly, or James Kelly, at Boys Town. And I think that he was part of that network. Because if the priests gave the kids privileges, no one would argue with that. So I think that Kelly was a compromised pedophile, and that he gave King et al. Access to the Boys Town kids. And then I've got a paper trail between Boys Town and Lawrence E. King, one of the primary pimps of the Franklin scandal network. So there's a lot of connections there. But I think Father Kelly was, and then there was another priest there that was sent to Argentina. At a certain point,
sent to Argentina.
Yeah. So, but Father James Kelly was, he was a major predator, and he preyed on God knows how many boys in upstate New York, and preyed on God knows how many, and with Boys Town, these are lower socioeconomic kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, dysfunctional families. And at Boys Town, they're being taken care of. They're being fed well. They're getting a good education. a lot of them want to stay there because it's the safest place they've ever been. And a predator like Father James Kelly knows that. And it gives him carte blanche to prey on kids. And actually, Boys Town has gone to bat for him because there's been people that have tried to litigate against Kelly. And the only reason why Boys Town hasn't paid out substantial settlements is because of the statute of limitations. They've hid behind the statute of limitations. And they're making millions of dollars in donations, Boys Town.
How did this network work? Who all was involved?
So there were two primary pimps, Lawrence E. King and Craig Spence. King and Spence were in Southeast Asia during Vietnam. King was in Thailand with a top security clearance. I don't know exactly what he was doing, but he had a top security clearance. And Spence was an ABC reporter in Vietnam. So I'm surmising that both of them, now, and they both came from working class, blue collar families. And I'm surmising that they both of them got busted molesting kids in Southeast Asia. And that's where they were turned. Because as soon as they came back to the United States, their careers just became, it was like a skyrocket. Lawrence E. King became the manager of the Franklin Credit Union and went from like $17,000 a year to making millions. I mean, a lot of that was ill-begotten. And Craig Spence went from ABC correspondent in Vietnam to a major power broker in Washington, D.C. as soon as he got back. And Craig Spence would have these huge parties at his place. He's very much like the Epstein character in the Franklin scandal. His house was wired for audiovisual blackmail. And what would happen at those parties is it would be like a bunch of power brokers would be invited. You name, I mean, it was a who's who of Washington, D.C. in the 1980s would go to Craig Spence's place. And there would be, a lot of times, if there wasn't just like outright pedophilic orgies, I mean, it would be like a cocktail party, a Washington, D.C. cocktail party. And people would be plied with alcohol. And then maybe at 10 or 11, something sexually inappropriate would happen. Or someone would fire up a joint or break out a line of Coke or whatever. And the people that were, didn't want any part of that would leave, but the people that wanted to be part of that would stay. And then his entire house was wired for audiovisual blackmail. So if you stayed, you got blackmailed. That was it. And I wrote a second book about, I wrote a book called Confessions of a DC Madam, The Politics of Sex, Lies, and Blackmail with Henry Vincent. And Henry Vincent used to give, Craig Spence used to get gay escorts from Henry Vincent. He ran a gay escort service. And we're talking in the mid-1980s, Craig Spence was spending $25,000 a month on gay escorts for him and his buddies. And King and Spence ran this pedophile network together. And they would get Henry, Vincent, and Henry was, and actually there is some comedic elements to this. Henry was a mortician. He had grown up in Southwest West Virginia in a very religious home. And he was gay, and he had to repress that. And he ultimately became a funeral director, mortician, and moved to Washington, D.C. for his mortuary fortunes. And then through just a weird set of circumstances, there was a couple of gay morticians that would hang out at this bar, which was kind of like the gay equivalent to Chippendales. And Henry met one of the dancers, and they went out for dinner, and the dancer told Henry that an escort service was up for sale because the guy was dying of AIDS. And Henry said, well, how much can you make? And the guy said, well, I can make like $1,000 a night if everything is right. And then Henry said, well, how much is the is he selling it for? And it was like $13,000. So Henry went from, and Henry's a very shy, guarded guy who had lived in the closet for all these years. And he just, it was completely out of character for him to do this. But he did it, and was a very brilliant marketer. What he did was, after he bought it, he called all the numbers in the DC Yellow Pages under escorts, male escorts. And most escort agencies are fly-by-night, and they don't pay their phone bill. So Henry would dial one of the numbers, and if the number was disconnected, he would call the phone company and say, I will pay the arrears on that phone number. So he ended up with half the numbers in the Yellow Pages of escort services. He's very brilliant that way with marketing. But anyway, and everything was going really well for him. He was working as a funeral director, and he was making a lot of money at this gay escort service. And then he got a call from Craig Spence, that CIS said. And then King and Spence would have Henry come to Spence's home, and they would pressure Henry to get him children, and he wouldn't do it. He said, I'm not gonna, I want no part of that. And this is kind of interesting. And there's a lot of corroboration about blackmail in the Franklin scandal, not just this, but so King and Spence were there, and Henry was there, and Henry didn't like King at all. And Spence they're both sociopaths, but Spence started to ask Henry about his life. Where did you grow up, and what college did you go to, and about and Henry, because Spence was so narcissistic, he had seismic narcissism. Henry thought, like he was watching the Red Sea parting, that, this narcissist was actually taking an interest in him. So, and Spence started asking him about his escort service and how he ran his escort service. And then all of a sudden, Spence stood up and he motioned him. And Spence went into a closet, and behind the closet was this compartment, and then behind the compartment was a room, and it was all monitors. And Henry was there next to Spence, and then Spence hit a couple of buttons, and then Henry is there on a monitor talking about his escort service. And Spence basically said to him, I blackmail people. You're blackmailed. So that was how Henry got indoctrinated into that. But, to his credit, he would not get them children. He just wouldn't do it. And that ultimately, I think, led to his demise, because the Department of Justice came after him pretty hard.
Wow. What, was there any justice served?
None whatsoever. That Franklin network, no one got indicted for molesting any children. And then there was a D.C. grand jury that covered it all up. Basically, Spence had killed himself. He's like Epstein. I do think now there's people that on the internet that speculate that Spence was murdered. I think Spence was told, either you kill yourself or we'll kill you. You can pick the time and the place if you kill yourself. Because his suicide was pretty bizarre. He was in the Boston Ritz-Carlton dressed in a tuxedo, and he overdosed on an antidepressant called nortriptyline. But anyway, so there were all these articles about blackmail going down by the Washington Times, and then the Washington Post was covering up for the government, saying that there was no blackmail. And but Henry Vinson, the guy was just running a gay escort service, and he was indicted on a 46-count RICO indictment. He was looking at 295 years in prison because what the government was doing was leveraging him. They said, we know what you saw, and we know that you could hurt us. But if you talk, you're going to spend 295 years in prison. So the government made a deal with him. If you talk, you're going to spend 295 years in prison. If you keep your mouth shut, we'll just send you away for 5. So he ultimately kept his mouth shut. And it's amazing because he was a very important interview for me when I was doing the Franklin scandal. And then he ultimately decided to write a book with me about it, which really gets into the Washington, D.C. side of things.
Wow. That's, I want to do a whole episode on that because I think it's important, but I really want to, there's so much going on with the Epstein stuff, and it's timely. It's right now. And so I want to concentrate on that for the majority of the time here. And I'd like to move into that. But I mean, I'm going to be honest, Nick. I'm worried to take the interview. I'm not going to bullshit you. I mean, I'm a former SEAL, former CIA guy, been all over the world doing dangerous shit. But this, I mean, they tried to assassinate the judge that was on the Epstein trial, correct?
There was someone who's killed her husband and son.
Yeah, he was posed as a UPS driver.
Yeah, and that was covered up pretty quickly. I never really had the time to get to the bottom of that, but that's something I'd like. The thing with this is, I've written 2 books about it. I've been screaming about it from the rooftops for quite some time. Until Epstein came along, no one was taking me seriously. But once Epstein came along, and once I published that Epstein's Black Book on the internet, people did start to take me seriously. It's something, the toothpaste is coming out of the tube now. And that's why people are willing to take it on. I mean, no one has been more vocal about Epstein than me. And I'm still kicking. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, and that's the thing. The government can't kill all of us. I mean, if the government kills me, they have a martyr. The last thing that they want is a martyr. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there was a time when I was writing the Franklin scandal. I mean, I think that's when I was at my most vulnerable. But once the book came out, I felt pretty safe. And then what I did is every time I got a document, I disseminated it. Every time I got an interview, I disseminated it. So if something did happen to me, there was going to be a record of what I was doing.
Did you feel like that with the Epstein stuff?
With the Epstein stuff, I'd been I was kind of an old pro at it by the time I came across Epstein. When I got his Black Book, I knew that was a little dicey, for sure. But then here's the thing. I went to the mainstream media and I tried to get them to publish the Black Book, and no one would do it. And then it took me 3 years to finally get someone to publish that Black Book, because our media it's either compromised or just unbelievably corrupt.
Who did publish it?
Gawker. Which and Gawker was a website that would take on all kinds of crazy stuff, and they ultimately got sued into oblivion by Peter Thiel, who's a billionaire who founded PayPal, and they outed Peter Thiel as a closeted gay guy, and then Peter Thiel let it be known that anybody that litigates against Gawker, he was willing to pay their entire litigation, and then Gawker ultimately released a video of Hulk Hogan having sex with, I believe, a friend of his wife, and but don't quote me on that. But ultimately, Hulk Hogan got a huge multi-million-dollar judgment against Gawker that caused him to crumble. But they were willing, they did stuff like that, but they were also willing to take stories from guys like me, where no one else would touch it, and once we published that Black Book, I mean, it was huge. I mean, it got tens of thousands of hits really quickly.
I'll bet.
And then I was able to write some articles about it. And no one else in the mainstream media would have given me that opportunity.
I saw that you had a decent article in Vanity Fair, it seemed like.
Yeah, about me. Yeah.
But, well, before we dive too deep into the Epstein stuff, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll just dig in.
Sounds good.
Those of you that have been around SRS for a while know that we take mental health very seriously here. So seriously that in almost every episode, you'll find a segment where we discuss how to improve your mental health. And part of improving your mental health is keeping your mind sharp. And part of keeping your mind sharp is giving it the fuel that it needs to balance energy, focus, cognition, and just regenerating your brain. That triggered me to go on a journey to find the supplement that supports brain health with the cleanest of ingredients on the planet. And I found it. I was actually going to start my own company and do this, but I found Laird Superfoods. I've partnered with them. Now I'm a partial owner, and I really believe in these products. Here's my favorite product. Performance Mushrooms by Laird Superfoods. Brain Fuel. You can put this in your coffee, you can put it in your tea, you can drink it raw, you can mix it with their greens, you can do all kinds of stuff. Bottom line is, this is the best possible supplement with the cleanest ingredients, all sourced in the United States that supports brain health. And here's two other products that I'm a fan of. Laird Superfoods Creamer. Guess what? Contains functional mushroom extracts. Put this in your tea or coffee. And most of you know I'm not a caffeine or coffee drinker, but a lot of you are, and they just happen to have Laird Superfoods coffee, organic Peruvian coffee with, you guessed it, functional mushrooms that support and regenerate your brain. Go to lairdsuperfoods.com, use the promo code SRS, you'll get 20% off. Guys, this is the real deal. These are the finest of ingredients. Check it out. LairdSuperfoods.com, promo code SRS, 20% off. All right, Nick, we're back from the break. We're going to dive into everything that you can tell us about Jeffrey Epstein. Just a couple of quick things. So you've been following Epstein since 2012.
2011, 2012, yeah.
Epstein was arrested on July 6th, 2019. Ironically, the day of the interview was July 6th. That's a weird coincidence. He died August 10th, 2019, roughly 1 month later. And Epstein pleaded guilty to soliciting underage girls for sex in 2008. He served only
13 months in a county jail.
Yeah, just 13 months. And
one count. Again, this was a grand jury, and the prosecutor of that grand jury was Barry Kirshner. And the Palm Beach Police Department had the statements of 5 minors who had been molested by Epstein, but they also knew, and then there were a number of corroborating statements, but they knew of 23 underage girls that had been molested by Jeffrey Epstein. And Barry Kirshner, the Florida attorney, only called 1, and he totally deconstructed her. I mean, he could have called 25. And actually, that grand jury didn't even indict him for molesting any girls. It indicted him on 1 count of adult pandering. And what happened was that Michael Ryder, who is really one of the unsung heroes in the Epstein story, he was the chief of the Palm Beach Police Department, he completely exploded. And he called this the greatest miscarriage of justice in recent history. And he went to the feds, and because he knew of 23 victims, and then he had taken heat too. I mean, he'd taken a lot. He'd been harassed, and I think found a dead animal or something like that on his front doorstep. But he's really a good guy. And the first time I was in Florida, I talked to him, and he looked me up on the internet, and he saw that I was serious about this type of stuff, and he called me back. And he wouldn't let it go. I mean, the state wanted to cover it up, the feds wanted to cover it up, but he would not let it go. And he made sure that Jeffrey Epstein got indicted at least on one count of solicitation of a minor or molestation of a minor.
It is hard to believe how many people are aiding and covering this up.
Yes.
Especially that we don't even know about yet. But let's just start at the beginning. What got your attention on this? How did it go from the Franklin scandal to Epstein?
Well, I mean, the Franklin scandal gave me. I researched the Franklin scandal for 7 years, and I traveled thousands of miles, read thousands of pages of documentation, talked to a lot of victims, and I developed a certain expertise in that area. Wasn't really trying to initially, but just I felt I had this drive to make sure that the Franklin scandal got published, that I wrote it and that it got published. And I developed an expertise in that area of child trafficking. So I was reading about Epstein, and I read that there were other girls that knew about Epstein or that came forward about Epstein, but he wasn't that grand jury hadn't indicted him on a single count of child molestation. And that's exactly what happened in the Franklin scandal. Nobody was indicted for child molestation, even though there were a bunch of kids. I had a list of 60 kids that had been involved in the Franklin scandal. So the exact same thing was happening with Epstein. And then so I went down there in 2012, and I started investigating, and I ended up with Epstein's Black Book. And
where did you start your investigation?
I started calling people that were involved. I called Michael Ryder. He was the police chief, the former Palm Beach Police Department police chief. I called people that had covered it in the newspapers.
Was he part of the cover-up?
Michael Ryder? No, he was part of it getting exposed.
Okay.
Yeah, he was like Mr. Stand-Up guy and all this. I mean, if it hadn't been for him, we wouldn't be here talking. Epstein would be rolling right now and trafficking girls. I'm pretty convinced. But he made such a stink about it that he made sure that the feds got involved. So then the feds had to cover it up. But when I got Epstein's Black Book, there was scores of victims.
Well, let's talk about the journey to get his Black Book. So how did it happen? I mean, I don't think you just show up and say, hey, can I take a look at that? How did you get access to that?
You cultivate relationships. Like with the Franklin scandal, I actually got some people in federal law enforcement to give me information.
Okay.
It took me some time. But once they see that your aim is true, and they don't think that you're going to snitch on them for helping you, that you're stand-up, then they'll help you. And someone took that chance with me and gave me the Black Book. And then I was down in Florida, and then I started calling. I wanted to get victims first. I mean, that was my first concern, was because there was like long lists of victims. And so I started calling these victims, and then they started telling me about being flown to different places into his island with other girls.
Well, let's get a little more in depth. So how many victims did you talk to?
At that point, I talked to, I believe, 4.
How were they soliciting them? How did the approach happen?
With Epstein just he would get girls and pay them like $200 to get other girls. So, and that's exactly how it works with Franklin, where if you bring someone in, they'll pay you money.
Okay.
So, and he just had this huge machine that was funneling girls. I mean, he had all these girls and procurers looking for other girls.
How young did the girls go?
Okay, so the mainstream media has said 14, but I don't think that that's true.
That's inaccurate.
We're talking as young as 11 or 12.
11 or 12.
Yes. And actually, I believe that one of the victims that litigated against Epstein was 13 at the time. So the mainstream media has done such a disservice to these girls because it has sanitized that trafficking network. I mean, those girls were younger than 14, definitely. And the viciousness that some of them were subjected to. I mean, some of these, and I saw this in the Franklin scandal, some of these guys like to beat up these little boys or little girls. I mean, and some of these guys are unbelievably powerful. You would know their names. And that's what they like to do. That's how they get off.
Do you know the names?
Some of them, yeah.
Are they in the black book?
Yes.
Who are they?
Yes. One of them is a former prime minister. And he, according to one victim I talked to, liked to beat up victims.
Why don't you want to say the name? I'm just curious.
I think that just the information that I've given you is enough for someone to basically determine who he is.
Where could they find the names?
Okay, so Gawker published the Black Book. It's online. If you Google Nick Bryant Gawker Black Book, it'll be there.
It's out there.
And actually, this gentleman is circled. Alfredo Rodriguez was the house manager.
Well, hold on. Before we get into all that, where were they flying these girls? Who would they fly with?
These girls were flown everywhere, and they were flown with politicians.
How many at a time?
It all depends because we don't really know. I mean, we've got passenger manifests, but it's hard to know how honest. But there was definitely, like Alan Dershowitz, he said that he'd never flown with Jeffrey Epstein. And in the article that I wrote for Gawker, he's on a passenger manifest with Tatiana and Claire and Alan Dershowitz said, "I've never molested any of these girls, blah, 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 blah." And then he's nailed, though.
Who is that? I don't know who he is.
Alan Dershowitz is a famous attorney.
Okay.
That was part of the Jeffrey Epstein network. And he got nailed. I mean, he said that he only flew with, actually, he's one of the most famous attorneys in the world. There's been, I think it was Reverse La Fortune about Klaus von Bülow, who he was convicted or arraigned for killing his very wealthy wife, and Alan Dershowitz represented him. So, and he is was a leading scholar at Harvard, legal scholar at Harvard. And he was a good friend of Jeffrey Epstein's. And one of the girls that has come forward and said that she was molested by Alan Dershowitz. Another girl has said that she wasn't a minor, but she had been pandered to Alan Dershowitz. And then another woman has said, another Epstein victim has said that Epstein had a house in New York and that there would be quote unquote model auditions in the second floor. And there would be young girls there. And Alan Dershowitz went right up the stairs to where the young models were being auditioned. So
they would fly these young girls 11 to, let's just say 11 on up.
I mean, some of them were 18, 19, 20, 21.
Okay.
I mean, the thing is, Epstein liked girls that were like 13 or 14. But if you wanted someone that was younger, I mean, Epstein is a psychopath. Mm-hmm. If you wanted someone that was younger, he didn't have any problem with that. If you wanted someone that was older, he didn't have a problem with that either. I mean, he had the type of girls that he liked. But if you were part of that network, you'd get anything you wanted.
So where all would they fly him to? Obviously his island. Where else?
Some were flown to Los Angeles. I've got a bunch of passenger manifests too.
Did he just have houses everywhere?
He had houses. He had a house in Palm Beach. He had a house in New York City. He had the island, and then he had a place in a huge place in New Mexico. And there is a girl that has come forward in a deposition, and she said that she had been molested by both Bill Richardson and Bruce King, and both of them had been former governors of New Mexico. And actually, Bill Richardson was a Democratic high flyer. He was Bill Clinton's energy czar. And what's really interesting is Epstein had to register as a sex offender everywhere except New Mexico. So obviously, some people very high up in the New Mexico political machinery were doing favors for Jeffrey Epstein. And according to one of the victims, she was molested by two former governors of New Mexico.
Was everywhere just all of his properties were involved in this? It wasn't one specific one?
No, I mean, Epstein, I think, and he had a place in the UK, he had a place in France. I mean, this was his business.
How many girls do you estimate were involved in this from start to finish?
Oh, man, it's tough. Like Epstein, just himself was, as his addiction accelerated, he was like 3 girls a day. So, but then you get in, you're looking at Epstein, 3 girls a day, but then you're looking at all these guys that he pandered girls to. Hundreds. And he was doing, now granted, like when he probably started in the mid 90s or early 90s, he wasn't as full throttle as he was in the early 2000s. But he had a run there of 25 years where he was trafficking girls. And just his own personal deviant appetites were 3 a day. So that kind of gives you an idea of how massive that trafficking network was.
How did he get started?
How did Epstein get started?
How did he get started?
Where
did he come from?
He comes from Coney Island, from a working class family in Coney Island. And I've heard stuff about him that he could have been chosen earlier to be part of this as a young man. So he was a college dropout, and he got a job teaching math at Dalton, which is the most prestigious school in New York City.
Who would have recruited him at a young age?
I do not know. It's one of those things like with King and Spence. They were in Southeast Asia, and then they come back to America, and then all of a sudden their star rises. The same thing with Epstein. We do not know.
Who do you have any?
I do not know. William Barr, the Attorney General under Donald Trump, who covered up Epstein, and actually he covered up Franklin too, because he was the Attorney General under Bush 1. When the Franklin scandal was covered up. So he's a really dirty guy. I mean, and he's been involved in all kinds of other dirty stuff too. His dad was running Dalton shortly before Epstein got hired there. So people have speculated that his dad had something to do with Epstein getting hired, but we don't really know. But what's really interesting is William Barr's father wrote a sci-fi novel about intergalactic sex trafficking, which is, kind of strange. And then Jeffrey Epstein ends up working at Dalton, and then he has this. He gets involved in with a number of trading companies, and then ultimately.
I mean, how does he get involved, though?
Well, that's the thing.
He's a college dropout. He gets put in there by Barr's I'm sorry, did you say Barr's father?
It's people are surmising that it's Barr's father who got him a job at Dalton. And then he was in some trading companies. He was with Stephen Hoffenberg, who got busted. At that time, Hoffenberg was guilty of the largest Ponzi scheme ever. It was before Bernie Madoff. Now, with Hoffenberg, I met with Hoffenberg. He's dead now. But he said that Epstein was involved. But Epstein was allowed to skate. But the thing with Hoffenberg is he was a very, very wealthy guy who did 18 years in prison. And I don't think he came out of prison as the paragon of sanity. So I never really knew what to make about what Hoffenberg was telling me.
Okay.
It could have been all true, or I don't know, but I think that Stephen Hoffenberg was psychologically troubled. And after he got out of prison. But where Epstein got his big break was in the early 90s. Les Wexner, who is the head of The Limited, Victoria's Secret, multi-billionaire, he gave Epstein the keys to his kingdom, power of attorney over everything. And Epstein was allowed to do whatever he wanted with Les Wexner's fortune, anything he wanted. He was given power of attorney.
I mean, but he didn't. I mean, he barely even knew him, correct? This wasn't even
they'd known each other for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. But I think Les Wexner is a pretty dirty guy. I mean, he's also been named as a perpetrator. And I do believe that he is a perpetrator. And he and Jeffrey Epstein, Les Wexner has a very interesting history. He's got a history with the mafia. There was an attorney whose law firm worked for Les Wexner's Limited. His name was Arthur Shapiro, and he was shot in the back of the head twice, execution style, in Columbus, Ohio, which is where Wexner lives and where the Limited is headquartered. So it was very much a mafia hit, and there was a police report, a homicide report. I've got it, that came out, and it named Les Wexner as the chief suspect of that homicide, and it talked about all of Les Wexner's mafia connections, which I was able to corroborate. The police chief of Columbus ordered that homicide report to be destroyed. But I got a copy of it. So I'm good at getting stuff. So, but yeah, Les Wexner is the prime suspect as far as being the prime mover of that homicide. According to that homicide report.
Why do you think, what was his fortune? How much was it?
He's estimated to be worth at least $4 billion.
Why would he, is it blackmail? Why would he hand over the keys and give full power of attorney to Jeff Epstein other than blackmail? Do you think it was blackmail?
It's either blackmail or they're both into something very sordid together. And here's what people don't understand about Epstein, and they didn't understand this about Franklin. Jeffrey Epstein was blackmailing some of the most powerful men in the world. Mm-hmm. All you got to do is look at his black book and see that he was blackmailing some of the most powerful men in the world. Now, Jeffrey Epstein was a college dropout from working class Coney Island. Is Jeffrey Epstein going to be able to blackmail Les Wexner, who has connections to the mafia? There's no way in hell. Jeffrey Epstein would have a very brief life expectancy if he did that. But the thing about it is, if he's got an intelligence apparatus behind him, mm-hmm. and they make it known to whoever he's blackmailing, no one touches Jeffrey Epstein, or else pictures are going to come out, or whatever. That's the only way that Jeffrey Epstein is able to blackmail.
So you think that Jeffrey Epstein had an intelligence organization behind him?
Oh, absolutely.
Or more than
no
one?
doubt about it.
U.S. intelligence organization or another country's?
Well, yeah, okay, so people speculate that it was Israeli and not American. But here's the thing about that, and I try to explain it to people. There's no way that American intelligence is going to let Israeli intelligence compromise American politicians without getting a cut of that intelligence. There's just no way.
Maybe. I mean, why wouldn't they? Maybe if Jeffrey Epstein has blackmail on literally all these powerful people, I mean, and it seems that they all fold immediately. You know, maybe he had something on the U.S. side of things, and they were like, hey. Next on the Sean Ryan Show. It was an ABC correspondent that got fired who came out and said that she wanted to cover the story, and right before she went on to cover it, it was, hey, cut it, we're not doing this.
First of all, I was told, who's Jeffrey Epstein? No one knows who that is. This is a stupid story. Then the palace found out that we had her whole allegations about Prince Andrew and threatened us a million different ways. We were so afraid we wouldn't be able to interview Kate and Will that also quashed the story. And then Alan Dershowitz was also implicated in it because of the planes. She told me everything. She had pictures. She had everything. She was in hiding for 12 years. We convinced her to come out. We convinced her to talk to us. It was unbelievable what we had. Clinton. We had everything. I tried for 3 years to get it on, to no avail.
I don't even know why anybody who has... I can't even imagine applying for a position at the FBI nowadays. Well, I don't understand what they do.
So the FBI had hundreds of DVDs of Epstein. I'm sure a lot of them were compromised DVDs, and I'm sure a lot of them were just child pornography. So they've gone into a black hole.
Hey everybody, I'm Sean Ryan. Click here to subscribe to the Sean Ryan Show YouTube channel for the hottest and most compelling interviews that you will not see anywhere else. I've also made a playlist of all the previous SRS episodes so they're easy to find. You can find that right here.